Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. This video is about the bicentenary of the death of Napoleon Bonaparte, because on the 5th day of May in 1821 he was called to his reward, and his very last words that he ever breathed were Tête de l'armée, Joséphine, head of the army, and then Joséphine, the name of supposedly the love of his life, his sometime wife. I mean, her name was actually Joseph, but that can be feminine in France, but known as Josephine. Although Andrew Roberts has said this idea that he adored her is overblown, and within a year of their marriage, they're both having affairs. He eventually had the marriage annulled on some spurious basis because the papacy will give the wealthy and mighty what they want, because Napoleon wanted to marry Marie Louise, the daughter of the Emperor of Austria. But Napoleon is much more than a brandy. He's a highly complex figure. He cast a long shadow. Ultimately, not much remained of his achievement. I mean, he very briefly united Europe, ruling everything from Spain to Russia, but that only lasted a couple of years till it all collapsed like a house of cards. So he's a mixed picture. There's obviously an immoral side to him, launching these wars of aggression, although he sometimes had an arguable case that he was the aggressed party. Now, I know he's not the only figure in history to launch wars of aggression. Emancipating people sometimes, some positive things, making Poland independent again, and obviously Poland was a much more politically advanced and humane society than Russia, not being Russophobic at all, but Russia didn't really bring any benefits to Poland, whereas being conquered can sometimes be good for you. In the case of Poland, it really wasn't when they're conquered by Russia, or whatever else, the Napoleonic Code and so on. I'll come on to that. I don't think he's a monster. There's only one atrocity I can think of that he committed. Okay, one thing that really was a retrograde step, and I'll come on to this, is seeking to reintroduce servitude in the Caribbean. So that was a case when he was outright satanic, and he was going against what France had earlier done. So people say that there's such a thing as Napoleon complex, and that's one of the greater misconceptions about him. He was actually a shade above average height for the time. France used feet in inches back then, but a French inch was bigger than a British inch. So therefore, if he seems 5'2", that's according to French feet in inches, which is 5'7" amongst Britannic measurements, which made him just a tiny bit taller than the ordinary man back then. So there's this idea that men who are lacking in stature, they are overly assertive and are really impelled to prove something because they feel this crushing sense of inferiority due to their height, which there's been research on it and it's largely bogus. So you do get some short guys who are too boorish or too pushy or whatever, or too pugnacious, but that's usually not because of their height, apparently. Of course, you get people of all sorts of heights who are like that, and they're not overrepresented amongst those who are short. And the research shows that actually these tall guys try and throw their weight around because they think they can and get away with it. So the Napoleonic Code is something that lasted. Of course, he didn't write it. He was no scholar of jurisprudence, but yes, he did give his imprimatur to it. And the very first part of it saying that nothing in his is retroactive, because retroactivity would be in breach of the principles of natural justice. And fascinatingly, it was more or less the same sequence as Corpus Juris Civilis by Justinian, or even Commentaries on the Laws of England by Sir William Blackstone. So then there was Bonapartism, even an ideology that was invented in the mid-19th century by his nephew and imitator Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. I was going to come on to that. So yes, he's had people who try to imitate him consciously. Well, Jean Badel Bokassa, who was briefly emperor of the Central African Empire, is now the Central African Republic. Someone I found scintillating as a child. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto of Pakistan was also a great admirer of his, and said, I've got to learn how to control my generals. And perhaps there were others who tried to emulate Napoleon as they would see it. So Bonapartism, even to the end of the 19th century, was a significant political force in some regions of France. Now, to his nemesis. He was the proto-Hitler, which I think is ludicrous. Um, he wasn't against any European nationality, saying that Europe is too small, we must unite it. Was he, in a sense, a precursor of the European Union? Perhaps. But I don't think he's enigmatic either. How do I see him? Well, a megalomaniac, um, not savage, uh, even starting wars of aggression. I know that's bad. Okay, people get killed, real people get killed, but I'm not aware of massacres of civilians that he ordered or anything like that. And just an opportunist. So he's born in Corsica in 1769, which only the year before had been sold by the Republic of Genoa to France. And so the Corsican spoke Corsu, which is a dialect of Italian. He grew up speaking that, and presumably standard Italian, obviously learning Latin at school. He didn't start even learning French till he was 9, which is why he never lost his Italian accent. And at school, he was picked upon and dubbed paille au nez, as in straw in the nose, in mockery of his accent. Because he went to boarding school in Brienne. It was run by Minim monks, not that far from Paris. I mean, as a measure of how Italian it was, his father, Carlo, had studied at Pisa in Italy, and the surname was even spelled Buonaparte, as in good part. The U was dropped in his adulthood, Napoleon Bonaparte's adulthood, to make it seem more French. And it was actually, there's an E on the end, Napoleone, it would have been. The Leone part, the line of the name, maybe that inspired him, nominative determinism. The Napo, I'm not sure, but it's close to some Corsican dialect word meaning something like disruptor, and indeed he was a very disruptive force throughout Europe. So he was one of 14 children, and his mother, married at 14, became pregnant at that age, would have been considered entirely acceptable at the time. I know it would be illegal now in almost every jurisdiction, but bear in mind, well, we've been around for 3.5 million years. This idea of age of consent's only been around for a couple of centuries. I know it's a good thing, but lifespan was much, much shorter, and girls had no schooling in most cases, well into the 20th century in many countries. So they weren't trying to finish their education first. So Joseph was his elder brother, and Louis is the one younger than him. So it was at mathematics and history that he excelled. There's a famous story where he led the juniors against the seniors in a snowball ball fight, and they won his first example of generalship. So then he wanted to be commissioned into the army. He succeeded in that. Was a competent officer. Went into the artillery because he was a mathematical whiz, could calculate the angles they needed to be fired at. And this came in lucky in the siege of Toulon, when it was held by French royalists with their British allies, as they knew how to fire the cannon such that it would hit the piers and so on to prevent the French or the royalists unloading supplies and so forth. So he was 20 years old when the French Revolution broke out. He threw his tricorn hat in with that. He was always a time server, and then he eventually became a Jacobin, as in the most radical revolutionary faction. And his elder brother Joseph was more involved with them. He was more political, Joseph. He had other brothers who were like Lucien, who were somewhat political. And he was even briefly imprisoned near La Côte d'Azur, but he manages to talk his way out of it. They're short of army officers, particularly artillery officers. He volunteered to go and fight in Italy, and that's where he really made his name. So he achieved so much, such rapid promotion, but that was partly because he was fortunate being around at the right time, a time when France was in turmoil, and so more seasoned army officers were fleeing, were being guillotined as counter-revolutionaries, and this opened up opportunities for him to be promoted extra fast because there were so many vacancies. That's why he rose up the ranks very quickly, whereas in peacetime that was difficult. I mean, he found peacetime garrison duty tedious, spent a lot of time reading, got leave, went back to Corsica. He read a lot about history. He was intending to write a history of the island. He was an admirer of Pascal Paoli, leader of the Corsican independence movement, but that didn't happen in the end. His family fell foul of Paoli, and then they were obliged to depart their island. I can't remember which historian said of Corsica, "I have a presentiment that this island will one day astonish Europe." And so it proved that Napoleon, who came from somewhere which was barely French, obviously rose to be emperor of the French, and rose to very briefly be master of the continent, someone who came from supposedly unpromising circumstances. Bear in mind, this is an era when much of Europe was still feudal, where absolute monarchy existed in France till after 1789. So his campaigns in northern Italy were where he really earned his stripes, fighting many battles there, showing his valor. Lodi, almost getting himself killed, had to be tackled to the ground by one of his staff, saying, "General, you'll get yourself killed." And he personally sighted some cannon at a battle, and this led to the great misapprehension that it was a corporal. He was never a corporal. He was commissioned as an officer, obviously several ranks above corporal. It's because he personally aimed the cannon, which was the corporal's job. People call him the little corporal. And then there was also the misunderstanding that he was short. He wasn't. In French, you call someone little. That's being affectionate, like little friend gives your girlfriend or boyfriend. Um, and so he insisted on a lot of art treasures being removed from Italy and sent back to France. Was this booty or were these reparations? Now he may have believed vae victis. Well, it was to the victor the spoils. These spoliations, I'm not sure they hacked off the Italians that much, setting up Cisalpine republics. Remember, France still was a republic, and some local worthies joining these things. Again, I would suggest largely out of opportunism rather than out of any political conviction. And he later had himself styled president of Italy, eventually king of Italy, but he's only interested in northern Italy. He had a complex relationship with the Catholic Church. Obviously, he was a cradle Catholic like every Corsican. And remember, in the early 1790s, Christianity was briefly outlawed in France, then brought it back. But he'd clashed with the Pope. The Pope had briefly been imprisoned. I think it was, Pius the Sixth, but then Pius the Seventh came along, and then they had a better relationship with them. Napoleon signed a concordat with the Pope who was going to respect Catholicism. He recognized that it was a social glue. He didn't want that as an enemy because the Pope had preached a holy war against Republican France. So Napoleon was quite canny in realizing at least neutralize Catholicism a threat, possibly get it on his side. Anyway, he was a man of boundless ambition, and that's why he sailed to Italy in 1789. He had toyed with the idea of an expedition to Ireland. Now, had he come to Hibernia, history might have been very, very different, because there was that summer, 1798, there was a rebellion in Ireland, and it was defeated. The Society of United Irishmen, this anti-sectarian Republican group who wanted to launch a revolution along the French model. And yes, French troops did land Lazare-Hoche at Mayo on the western coast of Ireland, but that was about 2 months after the main rising in Ireland had occurred in Eastern Ireland, and it had been quelled by the Crown forces. But had it been coordinated at the same time, would have had a much better chance of success. Had the French sent not a few thousand troops, but tens of thousands of troops, now we would have been talking, and that almost certainly would have succeeded. But Napoleon, he said, let's go to Egypt to disrupt British communications with India, the jewel in the crown, which is a madcap scheme because people sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. Nobody went overland from Egypt to India. The British didn't anyway, and there was so much desert in between. And this is 70 years before the Suez Canal was built. So I think it was part of his fantasy. He was fascinated by ancient Rome, that being the breadbasket of that, and he found Egypt enchanting. He was enthralled by its ancient history, by its magnificent cultural heritage, the pharaohs, the pyramids, and so on. And he said he imagined himself writing his own Quran, riding an elephant into Egypt, and being surrounded by dancing girls and so forth. So, as I said, he was a megalomaniac. I can't fault him for lack of imagination. But anyway, he quickly defeated the Mamelukes there. Remember, Egypt was a nominal portion of the Ottoman Empire, but the Mamelukes, this bizarre slave sect, had been ruling for centuries on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan. And he fought the Battle of the Pyramids. He wasn't actually within the sight of the pyramids, but he still called it that because he liked the romantic name, addressing his men, soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you. He actually seldom spoke in public. He was a poor orator, partly because his French was not flawless. He never quite mastered French grammar, which is why there are almost no documents in his own hand. He would dictate things and leave it up to his secretaries to silently correct his grammatical infelicities. So they were in Cairo, but then there was a rebellion. He couldn't control the whole Nile Valley. The Ottoman forces were massing, so he passed through Sinai into Palestine, or what we now call Israel, and defeated some Ottoman forces there. Plague broke out amongst his soldiers. He visited a plague hospital. that was quite courageous of him because he could have caught it. He did order the murder of some Ottoman prisoners who fell into his hand, about 2,000. I think is the only atrocity he actually committed. And there was a tiny Jewish community when he passed through. But eventually the Ottomans were closing in. He was being outnumbered. He lost control of southern Egypt because of an insurrection. The Battle of Abu Qir Bay, at the Battle of the Nile, most of the French fleet there in Egypt had been sent to the bottom by Lord Nelson. So things were collapsing around him. So he decided to leave his men in the lurch. He was completely dishonourable that way, take one of the few surviving French ships and hot-foot back to France. But later he helped stage a coup. I think that's the 18th Brumaire. But he became part of the Directory. So France was run by a triumvirate, him, Abbé Sieyès, or Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, formerly the Bishop of Autun, the author of Qu'est-ce que c'est la Tierceta, and Paul Barras. So Barras got tired of his mistress, Josephine de Beauharnais, and Napoleon took her off his hands and really fell for her. He was 6 years older than her, and he married her. She had 2 children from her first husband who had been guillotined. She herself had very narrowly avoided a date with the guillotine. So she'd been born in the Antilles. Her surname was actually Tachère de la Pagerie, a maiden name. But anyway, but she was able to bear more children. She was 6 years older than him, but she wasn't that old. You think she's still of childbearing age. But so they decided to have 3 consuls. Eventually became first consul. He'd be more senior to the other 2, and eventually sole consul, consul for life, using this ancient Roman word consul. They'd have no president, prime minister, and eventually becoming dictator. So all that radicalism had gone. The idea of anything close to democracy had gone. Votes for all, votes for women, that was gone. And controlling the press, tuning the pulpit, and so on. So setting up kind of a totalitarian state. But I won't give you blow-by-blow accounts of all his battles, fighting the Prussians, the Austrians, many minor German states, the Dutch, the British sometimes, and having bested them, bringing them over to his side, making the vassal states, having Prussia on his side, and a fixation with placing his siblings on the thrones of Europe. And marrying some of his sisters off to his marshals, appointing about 20 marshals. One of whom was a hereditary Polish prince. Now, he said that every private in his army carried the field marshal's baton in his knapsack. It's true that he did promote some people from the ranks, and he did promote some people from plebeian backgrounds, but that was very much the exception. He usually promoted those who were from upper class families. So the idea that he was a meritocrat is largely fallacious. So as I said, one of the most unattractive things about him is his racism, his anti-black attitude. I know white supremacism was common in the white world at the time, partly influenced by Josephine, who I said was born in the Caribbean, and her father owned black people as though they were mere chattels. So he imbibed that attitude, drunk deep of it. Of course, on the flag of Corsica, there are black men's heads. I suppose they're fighting the Moors. And maybe there was this in the blood, that people from Africa are evil. They're coming to attack us because they've been raiding the Mediterranean, carrying off slaves to Africa, whites as slaves. No hay mariscos in la costa, as the Spanish say. There are no Moors on the coast, like we'd say the coast is clear. But anyway, he was a tremendous liar. There was the expression lie like a bulletin in France, because Le Bulletin was the official government newspaper, and announcements, and he often had the chronicles of battles rewritten several times to exaggerate his role in them. And I was an enormous admirer of her when I was a little boy, But then I found out that he had a numerical advantage almost every battle he won, but that was partly because of his tactics of the position of the centre and trying to hold off, army this side and have overwhelming superiority to annihilate an army on that side, and then go and defeat the first army onto his right. So it was all about speed. That was the determinative factor. But he didn't look after his men. He just abandoned the wounded to die, cut back the commissariat or any medical services. He was an artillery officer, liked to have a ground battery in the middle, but he became a bit predictable. And great at manoeuvres like the Ulm manoeuvre, enveloping the enemy, getting them all to surrender with not a shot fired. So he staged various rigged referenda to justify things, went like in 1804 proclaiming himself emperor, and then inviting the Pope to come along, and the Pope did come along to Notre Dame. So Napoleon crowned himself, as Charlemagne had done a millennium earlier, And again, there's this bogus idea around that Napoleon snatched the crown from the Pope's hands to do it. No, that was prearranged, that he was always going to do it. And Madame Mère, his mother, was looking on. So she saved her pennies for a rainy day. When she saw all this opulence, she said, so long as it lasts, and indeed it didn't. But she had a tidy fortune. She retired to Rome, where the Pope gave her sanctuary, and she lived out of the rest of her days in great comfort. So that would seem to be the ultimate arrogance, making himself emperor. Had to go one better than the Bourbon, but he wasn't accepted by the other crowned heads of Europe, writing to the Tsar Alexander of Russia, dear brother emperor, who had said to him, dear General Bonaparte, wouldn't accept him as a real emperor. So he produced a fantastic impression on that young Emperor Alexander when they met at Tilsit on that barge. And could he have him as an ally? Bear in mind that every European monarch spoke fluent French at the time. That was the language of the upper class anywhere in the Occidental world, were from the United States to Russia, from Sweden to Croatia, anywhere in Christendom. A highly educated man spoke French. Bear in mind, most people were illiterate at the time. So many coalitions gathered against him, and too many coalesced. Well, he had this continental system to try and defeat the British. They're a nation of shopkeepers, he said contemptuously. So, give me the Straits of Dover for 6 hours, and I shall give you the world. Because if they could only control the Straits of Dover, La Grande Armée could land there. At Boulogne, he'd gathered an army for a year, he'd inspected them. Was it called the Army of England? And to defeat Great Britain, but never happened. Because, in October 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, most of the French fleet under Admiral Villeneuve had been sent to Davy Jones's locker, though Horatio Nelson had been killed at the battle. So just had to strangle British commerce, the continental system. All these European countries would refuse to trade with the United Kingdom, and the British economy would implode. Well, it didn't work, actually. That's when the British invented graphite for pencils, because they couldn't get lead. But the Russians started cheating on it and trading anyway. So Napoleon said, well, I must teach them a lesson. Got to make an example of them. If they break the rule and get away with it, everybody's going to break the rule and get away with it. And eventually decided to go and crush Russia. The rest is history. Obviously, Midsummer's Day, 1812, crossing the border into Russia, which is the fateful day that the Wehrmacht also attacked Russia. Technical victory at Borodino, getting to Moscow, which had been largely burnt, and having the informators shot, spending some weeks in the Kremlin, attempting to blow it up without success, and then the cataclysmic retreat from Moscow. Again, he was never one to stand by his men, taking a fast sleigh and hightailing it back to Paris. Admittedly, he was needed there. Rumours got around that he died. Some of the printing press had been printing bogus bulletins saying he died. So he had his Savary in charge of his corps of spies. About Napoleon is he wanted to amass power, but not really to abuse it. Didn't live in such great luxury, drank sparingly, I suppose he wanted recognition rather than huge palaces. Wasn't into putting a statue up everywhere, but was into his imperial status, having this N for his letter, chose a B as his symbol. Tells you a lot about him. It's meant to denote industry, because he was always so active and busy. And then so many countries had coalesced against him. They closed in 1804. He's being defeated, driven back into France. He'd lost the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations in Germany some time before. Some of these vassal states, like Prussia, had turned against him. And that's why at Fontainebleau, south of Paris, he'd had to abdicate, saying to the old guard, I shall return before the violets bloom again. He's Papa Violette, and exiled to Elba, off the coast of Italy. I'd really like to go there, actually. Even allowed to rule the island, bring 1,000 soldiers with him. There was a British governor there who was not Napoleon's jailer, but Napoleon managed to give him the slip after 9 months, and with 1,000 men sailed back to Golfe Juan on La Côte d'Azur, landing on the 1st of March. So he had come back before the violets had bloomed, and marching through the Alps to Grenoble, he knew was unpopular in Provence, and the city gates being broken down and laid at his feet to welcome him in, soldiers being sent to shoot him, and then opening his overcoat, saying, "Come on, shoot me. You can see where my heart is." But they cheered and went over to his side, some of them crying with joy he was back. Marshal Ney, having promised the obese Louis XVIII he would return Napoleon in a cage, but had promptly turned his coat and gone over to Napoleon. So Napoleon rode to Paris, and Louis XVIII hightailed it out of there. So he took over. Napoleon briefly making various proclamations about how he's going to rejig the constitution and give every man a vote. But he obviously completely didn't believe in democracy, or the word was scarcely even used, or even parliamentary government. He was a dictator. There were these sort of fig leaf parliaments. And he, despite being very, very busy in these 100 days he came back, he found time to issue a decree that the black people of the French colonies, the Caribbean, would be forced back into servitude. So it was vile like that. He was philo-Semitic, though. He'd issued some proclamation to the Israelites of Europe, as he called them, saying that they must have liberty and equality. And indeed, he had emancipated Jews in the German states. Some German Jews even took his name Schönteil, as in a translation of Bonaparte. Good bit is what it means. But that also led to some German anti-Semitism. Well, why did he like Jews? They must have helped him. They must have been, secret agents for the French. He'd also ironically helped unite Germany. I know he's slightly uniting Europe, but by giving them a common enemy, and the Freikorps were formed to fight against him. So he had plenty of soldiers in his army, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Germans, all sorts of nationalities were in his Grande Armée. Anyway, what was I going to say? Well, then he met his Waterloo. Won't talk about that. Exiled to Elba. Was he poisoned? Was there arsenic in the wallpaper? Maybe, but why wasn't everybody else poisoned? So he had a number of children with his mistresses. His one son was the King of Rome, as he styled them, or the Duke of Reichstag. Reichstag had gone to live with Marie Louise's family, the Habsburgs, in Vienna, but had died there at the age of 21, sometime after his father's death. And Hitler, what a nice guy, returned that guy's corpse to Paris, thinking the French would be grateful during the occupation. So Napoleon sent to St. Helena. Lucky he wasn't executed. But they just didn't execute head of state in those days. So I've seen his body was exhumed and returned to France in the 1840s. The British agreed to it, and one of his natural sons then marching the procession. But I've been to Les Invalides, where he lies in state, and it's a splendid monument, not too mournful, but it made me think, isn't it wrong that someone who caused the unnecessary deaths of at least hundreds of thousands of people is so exalted? What about the ordinary men? What about all the wrecked lives? What about the incalculable misery that he occasioned? And I know many rulers and generals have done that. So that's him. Is an indisputably impressive figure, though an amoral one. So that's my penny's worth on Napoleon. Able was I saw Elba. Probably the only palindromic sentence I know. Toodaloo.